The eviction notice arrived on a Tuesday, slipped under the apartment door while Nora was at the diner, refilling coffee for a man who left a $1 tip on a $22 tab. She found it at 2 in the morning, her feet still carrying the ache of a 7-hour shift, the paper yellow and official with a red stamp across the top that said Notice to Vacate in letters that left no room for negotiation. 60 days to settle 2 months of back rent or vacate apartment 4B at Creekside Gardens, which was neither Creekside nor a garden, but a 4-story concrete building on Spokane's east side, where the hallways smelled like old carpet, and someone on the 3rd floor played bass-heavy music 3 nights a week past midnight. By the end of this story, I'm also going to share something special with those of you who stick around to the end, something that can help you in your personal life. But first, let's get back to. She sat on the end of the couch without turning on the lamp, listening to Caleb breathe in the bedroom. 9 years old and still a deep sleeper, still had that child's ability to go completely unconscious the moment his head touched the pillow. She had lost that ability sometime around his birth and had not found it since. 2 months of back rent came to $2,000 for $180. She had $261 in her checking account and 320s in the bottom of her purse she had been pretending were not there, because once she counted them, they became real. The morning shift at Rosie's Diner on Francis Avenue paid $11.50 an hour. 6 days a week, 7 to 2. That worked out to somewhere around $900 a month after taxes, depending on how the tips ran. The cleaning job with Pinnacle Commercial Services had paid another $800, sometimes $9 if she picked up extra buildings. In September, Pinnacle lost its contract with the Meridian Tower on Riverside Avenue, and she lost 2 evenings a week with them. She had been looking for replacement work since, which mostly meant asking around during break and checking listings on her phone while Caleb did homework at the kitchen table. Apartment 4B cost $1,240 a month. Add utilities, groceries, Caleb's school fees, his winter coat from last year that was genuinely too small now, and the Honda's oil change she had been pushing back since July, and the math did not come close to working. She had already sold her laptop the previous spring. Her grandmother's silver bracelet had gone in August to a consignment shop on Division Street that gave her $60 for it. There was nothing left to sell. There was the car, a 2009 Honda Civic with 192,000 miles on it, and a cracked engine mount that made itself known every morning at startup. Selling it would leave her without transportation and cost her both jobs simultaneously. So the car stayed. She sat with the notice long enough for the building to settle into its nighttime sounds. The pipe in the wall doing its slow ticking. The elevator at the end of the hall cycling down. She had been here 3 years, long enough to know every sound Creekside Gardens made and what time of night it made them. She was 38 years old, and she was out of buffer. Nora had not grown up expecting anything to come easily. Her mother, Gail, had worked as a school secretary for 26 years and raised Nora and her older brother Derek in a rented house on the north side of Spokane with the cheerful practical discipline of someone who had decided very early that complaining took up too much time. There was dinner on the table and clean clothes for school, and someone who showed up to every play, every conference, every moment that required a parent. Gail had done it alone after Nora's father, Leonard, left when Nora was 12. Leonard Vance had been a mechanical engineer, a quiet man, the kind whose intensity was contained and internal, a person you could spend an hour with and still feel you had barely scratched the surface. He had worked for an agricultural equipment company in Spokane through most of Nora's childhood, coming home in the evenings to work in the small garage behind their house on projects he never fully explained. Gail used to say he had been married to his work before he married her and that the work had won. What Nora remembered most from those early years was not his distance, but the specific quality of his attention when something mechanical interested him. The way he would go completely still, his eyes focused on whatever he was studying, like the rest of the world had been switched off. She had sat beside him in that garage on dozens of Saturday afternoons, handing him tools she did not yet know the names of, listening to him talk through problems in the low, even murmur he reserved for things he was working out as he went. He had been a different person in that garage, more present, more himself. After the separation, Leonard bought 11 acres outside Colfax, in the Palouse, 50 miles southeast of Spokane. He remarried briefly, a woman named Diane who was gone within 4 years, and after that he was alone on the property with the farmhouse and his work. Nora had visited once during the dying years, at 16, a summer weekend her mother arranged with a combination of hopefulness and efficiency that was entirely Gale. The farmhouse was small and spare even then, and Leonard had taken her out to show her the land on the second afternoon. The northeast corner of the property was still open at that point, just a flat square of cleared ground where the grass had been graded and a rough concrete foundation poured. He had stood at the edge of it in his work boots with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the foundation with an expression she had not known how to read at 16, something between satisfaction and longing. He said he had been planning this for a long time. He said he had a collection. She had asked what kind, and he had considered the question for longer than it seemed to require, and then said that explaining it would take more time than they had that afternoon, but that someday she could see it. She had taken this as the kind of thing adults said to fill silence. She had not pressed him. She was 20 when the building was finished. By then she was in community college in Spokane, and the relationship with her father had thinned to a phone call every few months that neither of them seemed to know how to end or how to expand. She did not go back to Colfax. She heard from Gale that Leonard had completed the building, had sealed it, had gone to work in it every day. Gale reported this information without editorial comment, which was one of the ways she showed respect for people she did not fully understand. Derek maintained the relationship in the dutiful, efficient way Derek did everything, driving down twice a year, calling on birthdays, doing the reliable thing Nora had stopped doing. The estrangement between her and her father was not one event. It never was. It was Caleb's first birthday, Leonard making the drive up and sitting in her kitchen with the stiffness of a man who did not know what to do with himself in someone else's space, and Nora saying something she had been carrying for years about wishing he had been more present when she was small. Leonard had responded in the way of a person who genuinely believed his best was what it was, and that this conversation was therefore unnecessary. Both of them watched those words close the room like a door. He drove home that evening. She called once more at Christmas. The conversation lasted 8 minutes. After that, neither of them tried again. She had not seen his face in 6 years. Caleb did not know it at all. Caleb did not know, for instance, that the particular stillness Leonard had when he was working on something, that contained and quiet intensity that shut out everything else, was something she had inherited and passed on without fully intending to. She had seen it in Caleb when he read. When he worked at a problem, he went to the same interior place. She had never had an occasion to mention it. The phone call came on a Friday morning, 3 days after the eviction notice, while she was rolling silverware at the diner before opening. An unfamiliar 509 area code she did not recognize. Thomas Birch identified himself as an estate attorney based in Colfax. His voice was measured and unhurried. The voice of someone who delivered difficult news often enough to have developed a particular tempo for it. Leonard Vance had died on October 19th of a hemorrhagic stroke. He was 74. The service had been held quietly the following week at the Lutheran church in town, attended by fewer than 30 people. Derek had handled the arrangements. Birch expressed his condolences and then moved efficiently into the reason for the call. There was a will. She asked if her father had known he was ill. Birch said no. The stroke had come without warning. She thanked him for that, though she was not sure she believed it was a comfort. Some part of her thought she might have wanted the phone to ring one last time with a different kind of conversation. She would never know now whether she would have answered it. The will divided the estate without complexity. Derek received the farmhouse, the truck, and the savings account, which held approximately $14,000. He had been the one who stayed in contact, who drove down twice a year, who spent holidays in Colfax. Leonard had rewarded loyalty in the way men of his generation often did, with the tangible and the immediate. Nora received the workshop. She stood at the break table with the silverware rolled and forgotten in front of her and tried to place this information somewhere it would make sense. Birch explained. There was a concrete block building on the northeast corner of the property, set apart from the farmhouse by a quarter-mile of open land. Leonard had built it in 1994 on 3 acres he purchased specifically for the structure. Those 3 acres were hers. The access road from the county route was hers. The structure and its contents, whatever those were hers. He added that there was a sealed letter from Leonard to be given to her when she came to the property in person to collect the keys. She asked what was in the workshop. Birch paused in a way that told her the question had come up before and that the answer had not changed. He did not know. He had handled Leonard's estate matters for 12 years and had never been inside. The building had been padlocked since at least 1995, when he first began working with Leonard. The electric bill for the structure had been paid continuously through a separate account for 29 years. When he had asked Leonard about the building once, Leonard had looked at him with an expression that, Birch said carefully, tended to close conversations. She told him she would call back with a date to come collect the keys. She thanked him and hung up and stood in the diner break room for a long moment with the smell of coffee and industrial cleaner and the sound of the cook beginning prep through the wall. Her father had kept a building locked for 29 years. He had left it to her. Derek called that same afternoon, before she could reach him. His voice carried the careful, slightly elevated brightness of someone moving quickly past his own feelings on a subject. He said Leonard had gone peacefully, which was the phrase people used. He said he had already been to the property, had taken what he wanted from the farmhouse, was putting it on the market in January. Then he asked if Birch had told her about the workshop. She said yes. A pause. She had been hearing that particular pause her whole life, the small breath Derek took before saying something he had already decided to say regardless of whether it landed well. He said he was sorry she was getting the short end. He said the developer from Pullman who had already been in touch about the land couldn't care less about what was inside the building, just wanted the acreage for equipment storage. They were offering $45,000. 2 months of back rent paid twice over. 3 months of expenses as a cushion. Time to find the replacement cleaning job she had been putting off searching for. Derek said he could put her in touch with the developer if she wanted. Said it would be fast, clean, no complexity. Said the building was probably full of old tools and scrap metal anyway. That Leonard had always been the kind of man who held on to things long past the point they had any value. She listened to all of it. She told him she wanted to see it first. Another pause, shorter, more impatient. He told her that was fine, that the farmhouse keys were with Birch, that she was welcome to stay one night since the closing was not until January. He told her the padlock key was in the kitchen, 3rd drawer, left side. He told her to let him know what she decided. She thanked him and hung up and sat for a while with the letter from Birch in front of her. It was sealed, as Birch had said, a plain white envelope with her name on the front in her father's handwriting. She had not seen his handwriting in 6 years. She had forgotten she still knew it. She did not open it that night. She set it on the kitchen table where she could see it and made dinner for Caleb, helped him with a reading assignment, watched him fall asleep in the way he always did, sudden and complete, and then sat alone with the letter until past midnight. In 1994, she had been 9 years old. She remembered a Sunday afternoon when Leonard had driven up from Colfax to take her and Derek to the Science Museum, a rare custody visit, and on the drive back he had talked about a project he was starting. Something he had been planning for years, he said. A building. A proper space. He had used the word serious the way engineers used it. Not emotionally, but structurally. A serious space for serious work. She had been 9. She had not asked what the work was. She had been looking out the car window at the moving landscape and thinking about something else entirely, the way children did, and she had filed it away in that imprecise mental drawer where things went that did not yet have meaning. Now she was 38 and she was out of buffer, and her father had left her a locked building and a letter she could not yet bring herself to open. She drove down on a Saturday in early November. Caleb sat in the passenger seat with a library book about deep-sea fish open on his lap, studying illustrations of bioluminescent creatures with the focused interest he gave to any creature that lived somewhere improbable. The Honda ran adequately at 60 miles an hour with only one moment of temperature gauge anxiety near the top of the Steptoe Butte grade that resolved itself before she had to pull over. She kept one eye on the gauge for the rest of the drive, which was how she spent most of her time in that car, monitoring systems that were always one bad day from failing. The Palouse opened around them as they came over the first real crest of hills southeast of the city, the landscape shifting from suburbs into something older and more patient. The wheat had been in the ground for weeks, the October harvest already done, the fields stretching away in every direction in brown and gold and soft rustling, the hills rolling gently into each other all the way to the horizon. It was the kind of landscape that made you feel the size of things, the actual scale of the earth and the sky above it. You did not get that feeling in a city. You forgot it was available. Caleb looked up from his book and watched the landscape for a while, without saying anything. Then he said it looked like someone had folded the ground. She said she thought so too. Colfax was a small town built along a creek bottom, a grain elevator visible from the highway before anything else. The main street compact and quiet in the November way that farming towns got quiet when the season was over and there was nothing left to do but wait for spring. She stopped for gas at a station near the east end of town and asked the attendant if he knew the Vance property out on Route 195. He said sure. Said Leonard had been a regular. Said he had heard the news and that Leonard was a good man who kept to himself but always paid cash and was never any trouble. Kept to himself. She thought about those 3 words for the last 5 miles. The property came into view at the end of a gravel lane off the county road, marked by a metal mailbox with the number 3741 stenciled in white. The farmhouse sat close to the road, a modest structure from the 1960s, white with green trim that had weathered to something between gray and sage. A covered porch crossed the front, and a row of mature cottonwoods along the east side had dropped most of their leaves across the yard. Derek had been by. The porch was swept. A note from Birch in a sealed envelope was taped to the front door, along with a key. Nora stood on the porch for a moment before unlocking it. The day was cold and still. The sky the flat, heavy gray of eastern Washington in November, not threatening but permanent, the color of a sky that had settled in for the season. She could smell earth and something dry and clean, the smell of harvest finished and fields resting. And from the northeast, from beyond the farmhouse and across the open ground, she could not yet see, a very faint sound, low and mechanical and regular, the sound of something running on a timer. Inside, the farmhouse was spare. Leonard had not accumulated. The furniture was old and functional, a couch and armchair in the living room with the patina of long use, a kitchen table with 2 wooden chairs. The walls were almost entirely bare. 2 things hung in the living room. One was a large landscape photograph, the Palouse Hills in summer green, taken from somewhere on the property at a point where you could see 4 or 5 hills stacked behind each other into the distance. The other was a framed engineering drawing, a technical schematic in fine pencil lines showing a mechanical assembly she could not immediately identify from across the room. Something with gears. Something precise. She found the key in the 3rd drawer of the kitchen, left side, exactly where Derek had said. A Medico, the high-security kind with angular grooves along the blade, the type of key that could not be duplicated at a hardware store. It was on a plain metal ring with a small paper tag in Leonard's handwriting, Shopmaster. On the same ring, knotted onto the loop with a piece of braided leather cord, was a second key. Smaller, older, the blade worn smooth along one edge from what looked like years of regular use. No tag, no label, just the key and the cord, and the knot someone had tied and never undone. She stood in Leonard's kitchen with both keys in her palm. Behind her, Caleb was examining the engineering drawing on the living room wall, standing close to it the way he stood close to things he was trying to understand. "Mom, what is this a drawing of?" She came and looked. The schematic was detailed and technical, a cross-section of a mechanical assembly with notations in a handwriting she now recognized as Leonard's, smaller and more precise than the sign she had not yet seen. The central component appeared to be some kind of drive mechanism, a series of interlocking gears with tolerances marked to the 100th of a millimeter. Around it, connected by lines and arrows, were subsidiary components, each numbered, each annotated. At the bottom of the frame, a date, March 1997. She did not know what she was looking at, but it was clear that whoever drew it knew exactly what they were doing. She spent an hour in the farmhouse going through the rooms carefully, not looking for anything specific, just looking. There was very little to find. Leonard had not been a sentimental man in his public spaces. No family photographs in the living room, no trinkets on shelves. His bookshelves held engineering texts and technical references, and 4 years of back issues of a magazine called Automobile Quarterly that she had never heard of. His desk in the small room off the kitchen held paid bills organized by month, maintenance records for the farmhouse, and a folder of correspondence with Birch about tax filings. Nothing about the workshop. Nothing labeled. Nothing explained. She was about to close the desk drawer when she found the photograph tucked flat against the bottom, beneath the folder of correspondence. A snapshot, 4 inches by 6, printed on the glossy paper of a drugstore development machine from the mid-90s. The date stamp on the white border said September 1994. A young girl sat on a man's lap on a wooden stool in a large, unfinished space. Concrete floor, rough and unpoured in sections, sawdust on the ground. The concrete block walls still unplastered and raw. The girl was 9, maybe 10, with her hair in 2 braids and a gap where a back tooth had recently come out. She was looking at the camera with the serious expression children had in the era before everyone learned to perform for photographs. Nora recognized herself. The man holding her, his arms around her from behind, was her father at maybe 43 or 44, younger than she had ever thought of him. With the same contained stillness she remembered from the garage in Spokane and from the 16-year-old afternoon when she stood at the edge of the poured foundation and did not press him for details. He was not looking at the camera. He was looking at something off to the left, out of frame, with the specific focus of a person who was already thinking about what came next. On the back, in a handwriting slightly younger and looser than the version she had been seeing all afternoon, Nora, 1994. Before we close it up, she sat with the photograph for a long time. She did not remember the visit it documented. She did not remember being in that building before it was sealed. She had no memory of being held by her father in the space he was about to lock away for 30 years. But she had been there. They had both been there. She put the photograph in her jacket pocket, next to his letter. She opened Leonard's sealed letter from Birch. For lines, on plain paper, in his handwriting. Nora, I know I was not what you needed. I know I waited too long. I kept the workshop for you because it is the only honest account I have of who I really was. Do not sell it before you have seen it. Everything I want to say to you is inside that building. She read it twice. She folded it and put it in her jacket pocket. They walked to the workshop after a lunch of sandwiches brought from Spokane, eaten at Leonard's kitchen table in his spare clean kitchen while the cottonwoods moved in the cold outside. The path to the building was a quarter-mile of open ground that had gone to tall grass and volunteer shrubs. But there was a trail beaten through the growth, faint and direct, the trail a person made by walking the same route every day for years. The ground was hard with frost. Their breath came out in small clouds. Caleb stayed close without being asked. She smelled the building before she saw it clearly. Not a bad smell. The particular dry scent of a structure that was sealed against the outside and maintaining its interior environment. Climate control was not just a sound from here. It was something you could detect at 20 feet. The workshop was larger than she had expected. Birch had described it as a building, which was technically accurate and almost entirely uninformative. What she saw was closer to a small warehouse. Concrete block, painted once in industrial gray that had faded to something between silver and pale bone. The roofline was flat and plain, the peak close to 16 feet. The building ran perhaps 70 feet along its front face and appeared to go back at least 60. A single large corrugated steel garage door occupied the center of the front wall, padlocked with a heavy chain running through the door handle and through an eye-bolt set in the concrete beside it. 2 window openings sat on either side of the main door, but they had been bricked over from inside, the slightly different texture in the masonry visible if you looked for it. There was no decay. The masonry was intact. The roof showed no missing sections. No vegetation had grown up the walls, and after a moment she understood why. The grass along the building's perimeter had been mowed recently, within the last few weeks. Someone had been out here maintaining it. She walked the perimeter slowly. On the south wall, near the roofline, she found the first thing that made her stop. A round vent housing painted to match the wall, running on its own small electric motor, cycling with the low regular sound she had been hearing since the farmhouse. A humidity and temperature management system, running continuously. Someone had installed it to protect whatever was inside. Someone had kept it maintained and running for years. She found the sign on the north wall. It was attached to the concrete block with 2 lag screws, a piece of painted cedar about the size of a large book. The main lettering was old, the paint faded and cracked. Private. Do not enter. Beneath those words, affixed more recently on a smaller and rougher piece of the same cedar, in marker that had faded slightly but remained legible, was her father's handwriting. For Nora, when the time is right. She stood looking at it for a long time. Long enough for Caleb to come and stand beside her and read it and say nothing, which was the right thing to say. She touched the edge of the cedar with 2 fingers. It had been out here long enough that rain and cold had worked at it, but the words were clear. He had put it there knowing she might come, possibly knowing she was the only one who would. A car came up the gravel track from the road and pulled alongside the building. A Subaru Outback with a cracked taillight, driven by a woman in her early 70s with gray hair cut short and the deliberate, self-contained movements of someone accustomed to doing everything herself. She got out carrying a covered plate and crossed the open ground with the directness of someone who saw no reason to announce herself from a distance. Her name was Margaret Scholl. She said she had seen the unfamiliar car from her place half a mile up the road and had figured it might be Leonard's daughter, based on what Birch had mentioned at the post office. She handed Nora the plate, which turned out to hold oatmeal cookies wrapped in foil, and said she was sorry about Leonard. Said he had been a good neighbor for 22 years, which was long enough that when she said good, she meant something specific by it. She had been his bookkeeper for the farm accounts for the last 15 years. Just the basic financials, she explained. Property taxes, utility accounts, the maintenance fund for the building. She had never been inside the building. She had been to the property perhaps a dozen times in 15 years and had never passed the exterior of the structure. She looked at it now with an expression Nora could not entirely read. Nora asked if she knew what was in there. Margaret said no. She said Leonard had never told her and that she had stopped asking after the first year or two because it was clear the question made him uncomfortable, not in the way of someone with something to hide, but in the way of someone protecting something private from casual attention. She said she had her suspicions. She said the power bills for the building had always been substantial, more than the farmhouse in most months, which meant something significant was running in there continuously. She said there were other things she had noticed over the years, if Nora wanted to hear them. The deliveries, for instance. Every few months over the course of many years, a truck from one of the freight companies out of Spokane or Pullman would come up the county road, and the delivery would go to the workshop rather than the farmhouse. She had never seen what was in those deliveries. The trucks came and went quickly. Leonard signed for everything himself and did not invite conversation. She said she had heard things from outside over the years when the wind was right, and she walked the property line. Machinery sometimes, a kind of rhythmic precision that she had eventually decided sounded like something very carefully calibrated rather than something being built. Music occasionally, which she had always thought was strange, muffled by the concrete walls but present enough on quiet evenings that she could tell it was classical or something that functioned like classical. And once, about 8 years ago, a sound she had no real category for, something resonant and very low, a sound she said she could feel in her chest more than hear with her ears, that went on for close to an hour and then stopped entirely. She said Leonard had come over for coffee 3 days after that, and she had asked about it. He had looked at her for a moment, and then said only that he was making progress. She paused. She looked at the cedar sign on the north wall. She said she had asked him once, directly, what he was working on. This was maybe 5 years ago, a Thursday afternoon when he had stopped by her place on his way back from town. He had considered the question for longer than she expected. He was not a man who spoke carelessly. He said it was the most important collection in North America and that he intended to make sure it did not disappear. She had thought he was speaking modestly. In her experience, men who described their own work as the most important anything usually had a smaller opinion of it than they let on. Now she was not sure. Nora told her about the inheritance, about the developer from Pullman and the $45,000 offer, about the eviction notice, which she had not mentioned to anyone else. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, watching the building. Then she said she thought Nora should see the inside before making any decisions. She said she did not have a specific reason she could point to, not anything she could prove. She said Leonard had been a serious man. She said serious men did not spend 30 years and 30 years of power bills maintaining a building in a wheat field for nothing. She stayed 20 minutes, gave Caleb the last cookie from the plate, and drove back toward her own place. Nora tried the Medico key in the padlock. It fit cleanly, the key turning in a well-oiled cylinder. The padlock opened, but the chain itself had rusted at the eye-bolt connection, corroded shut, and when she pulled, the chain held. She could open the padlock, but not free the chain. She would need bolt cutters. Margaret, she guessed, would have bolt cutters. She took out her phone to call and realized she had no signal. She circled the building a second time, more slowly. The garage door had a rubber weather seal along its bottom edge that was still intact, no cracking, replaced in the last few years by someone paying attention. On the south wall, a utility connection, a gray conduit running from the building to a buried electrical line, with a small metal placard attached to the conduit reading 200A service. Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money. It's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical, step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now, let's get back to the story. The farmhouse was on 100 amp service. Leonard had run double that capacity to this building. He had done it deliberately, and he had maintained it across decades. She was looking at the west corner of the building, trying to make sense of a discoloration in the concrete, when Caleb called her from around the north wall. Not loud, just her name, in the tone he used when he had found something and was not sure yet what it meant. She came around the corner. He was crouched at the base of the north wall, roughly 20 feet from the cedar sign, using a stick to push back a section of blackberry canes that had grown up thickly against the building. Several seasons of growth, the thorned runners climbing 8 or 9 feet and spreading laterally across the face of the wall. She had walked past it without looking closely, but Caleb had crouched down and pushed the canes aside, and she could see now that the wall at that point was not continuous. A door, person-sized, set flush with the masonry, with no visible handle and a gap around its edge barely a quarter-inch wide, sealed with the same rubber strip as the main garage door. Standing in summer with the blackberries in full leaf, you would not know it was there. She took out the small key on the leather cord, a keyhole at hip height, nearly invisible unless you were looking for it. She inserted the key. It turned without resistance. The door swung inward on hinges that moved with no friction, no rust, no complaint at all. Recently oiled, recently used. The darkness beyond the doorway was complete. She turned on her phone's flashlight and held it up. The first thing was the smell. She had expected something stale, something of accumulated years and abandonment. What she got was the opposite. The smell of oil, clean and thin, the smell of maintained machinery. Leather, warm and worked in. Something dry and cedar adjacent. The smell of a space where humidity was controlled and temperature had been kept stable for a long time. It was not the smell of neglect. It was the smell of preservation, of care. She stepped inside. The scale of the interior was larger than the exterior had suggested. She knew that made no sense geometrically, but the impression persisted. The ceiling was high, 16 or 17 feet. The flashlight reached the far wall, and she could see that the building was deeper than it had appeared from outside. 60 feet, maybe 65. She looked down. Not concrete. Hardwood floors. Wide plank hardwood, sealed and polished to a surface that reflected the phone's light back at her in a soft, even sheen. The kind of floors you found in old ballrooms or the workshops of people who had decided that the surface beneath the work mattered as much as the work itself. Her footstep made a quiet, solid sound when she moved. Dry, maintained. The floors of a space someone had tended. She moved the light across the near wall. Pegboard, floor to ceiling, hung with tools on labeled hooks. Every hook occupied. The organization was precise to the point of being almost ceremonial. Each tool in a specific place, each label handwritten in Leonard's compact script. She could read some of them from where she stood. Spoke wrench, hubcap mallet, upholstery needle, curved, stitching all. She did not know the application of most of them, but she recognized the organization as the work of someone who needed to find the right tool in the dark and had designed the space so that was possible. The smell was stronger now that she was inside. Richer. She could distinguish layers in it. The mechanical oil, thin and clean. The leather, which was unmistakable and which suggested a significant quantity of it. Something older beneath those, a dry and faintly resinous quality like old paper and hardwood together. The smell of age that had been prevented from becoming decay. A smell you had to work to maintain. She moved the light slowly across the room. They were everywhere. Shapes under heavy canvas tarps, arranged in rows with deliberate spacing. Each one a different height, a different profile. Some as large as a refrigerator. Some larger. Some reaching 8 or 9 feet in height. Their covered forms standing in the darkness with the patient stillness of things that had been waiting for a long time. They stood in rows throughout the building, organized and intentional, the way objects stood when someone had thought carefully about how they should be kept. She moved the flashlight slowly down the first row. A workbench ran along the west wall, its surface organized with the precision of someone who put things back in the same place every time. Tools hanging on a pegboard, labeled hooks, each hook occupied. On the bench itself, a single hardbound logbook, its cover dark from handling, a red ribbon marking a page somewhere near the middle. She opened it. The inside front cover held one line in Leonard's handwriting. Full inventory ongoing. For the complete record, see the back. She closed it. She would come back to it. She moved deeper into the room toward the nearest covered shape. The tarp reached to the floor and pooled slightly on the hardwood, the canvas clean and unmarked by dust, as if it had been shaken out or changed within the last year. She crouched at the bottom edge and directed the light underneath the hem. A wheel, chrome, with wooden spokes. The tire was narrow, a pale rubber slightly yellowed with age but fully intact, still holding its shape. It was attached to something low and dark and curved, a fender line that she recognized before she could name why she recognized it. Something in the shape was ancestral, a form that lived in old photographs and museum halls and the deep background of films set in another era. She had seen wheels like this in glass cases. Never on something that looked like this. Never on something that looked like it had been maintained. She sat back on her heels. The flashlight swept across the row of covered shapes, then the row behind it, then the row behind that. The light reached its limit. The back of the building faded into darkness before she ran out of shapes. "Mom." Caleb's voice was very quiet beside her. "I found a light switch." She looked up. He was standing near the door they had entered, one hand on a toggle switch mounted at shoulder height on the wall, standard size, the kind in every building. "Try it." He flipped it. Nothing. The power was off at the panel, the breakers tripped, or simply switched off when no one was here to tend them. She would need to find the breaker box, probably on the exterior south wall near the utility connection. She would need bolt cutters for the main door chain so she could get a better look in daylight. She would need Margaret and a vehicle and most of tomorrow. Her phone battery reached 2%. The screen gave a single warning vibration. She stood and moved the flashlight one final time across the interior. She swept it slowly from left to right, counting the covered shapes as the beam crossed each row. She counted to 20, 30, 38. She pushed the beam further, trying to reach the back wall before the phone died. 41, 43, 46. The screen went black. Total darkness. No light source anywhere. Not even around the door frame because the door had swung nearly shut behind Caleb when he came inside. She stood in complete dark in the middle of a polished hardwood floor in her dead father's sealed building and waited for her eyes to adjust to something. They did not. There was nothing to adjust to. Neither of them moved for a moment. "Mom." "Yeah. Are there a lot of them?" She stood in the dark and thought about the rows of covered shapes, the polished floor, the climate control humming in a slow cycle outside, the logbook on the bench, and her father walking this path from the farmhouse every single day for 30 years. She thought about the cedar sign with her name on it, weathered by the seasons, patient as the hills behind it. "Yes," she said. "I think there are a lot of them." Caleb was quiet for a second. Then, "My phone is in the car." She reached out in the dark until her hand found his shoulder. "Let's go get it," she said. They felt their way to the door and back into the cold November air and the flat gray light of the Palouse afternoon, and Nora stood outside the sealed building that her father had left her and looked at the cedar sign one more time with the wind moving the dead grass around her feet. She thought about the photograph in her jacket pocket. Herself at 9 years old, sitting on her father's lap on a wooden stool in this building before it was sealed, Before the floors were laid and the tarps were arranged, and the climate control was installed and the windows were bricked over. Before the padlock, before the sign, before 30 years of every morning walking this path in every kind of eastern Washington weather. She had been there at the beginning, and she had not known it. She thought about what Margaret had said. The most important collection in North America. She thought about Leonard saying it with the matter-of-fact tone of an engineer quoting a specification, not bragging, just reporting. She thought about the power bills and the quarterly freight deliveries and the sound that could be felt in the chest from half a mile away. She thought about the logbook on the bench with its single opening line. Full inventory ongoing. Whatever was inside that building, Leonard had spent 30 years assembling it. He had spent 30 years powering it, maintaining it, walking to it every morning in every kind of weather. He had sealed the windows and oiled the hinges and replaced the weather strips and run 200 amps of electricity through a buried line to keep it alive and preserved in waiting. He had not sold it. He had not given it to Derek, who would have sold it without hesitation and called it practical. He had not given it to a museum or a foundation or anyone else. He had left it to the daughter who had stopped calling. Tomorrow, she would get the bolt cutters from Margaret. Tomorrow, she would find the breaker panel and restore the power. Tomorrow, she would open the main doors and let the November light into that space for the first time in 29 years. Tonight, she walked back along the frost-hard path to the farmhouse with Caleb beside her, the logbook tucked under one arm, the photograph pressed against her chest in her jacket pocket. She walked in the quiet that the Palouse made in November, the particular silence of harvested fields and cold sky and no traffic for miles, and she let the silence sit with her without trying to fill it. Something was shifting. She could feel it the way you felt a change in air pressure, not the thing itself, but the atmosphere the thing moved through. She did not know what was in that building. She did not know what 46 covered shapes on a polished hardwood floor added up to, or why her father had spent the last chapter of his life preserving them, or what he had meant when he said, "Everything I want to say to you is inside." She knew only that the developer's $45,000 was no longer a serious number. She knew that she was not going to call Derek back tonight. And she knew that when she woke up tomorrow in her father's farmhouse in the November cold, she would walk back across the frozen grass to the building at the edge of his land, and she would open it properly this time, in the light, and she would begin to understand what Leonard Vance had spent 30 years of his life building in secret. Some things were worth more than the number someone put on them before they knew what they were looking at. She was starting to believe, with a certainty she could not yet fully explain, that this was one of them. She sat at Leonard's kitchen table until past midnight with the logbook open in front of her and Caleb asleep in the farmhouse's single spare bedroom, in a bed that smelled faintly of cedar and old cotton. The kitchen light was a bare bulb in a ceramic fixture, the kind that gave everything a slight warmth and made the edges of the room soft. She had made tea from a box of Lipton she found in the cupboard. The mug said Colfax Harvest Days 2009 on the side. She held it with both hands and read. The logbook was a standard hardbound composition book, black cover, college-ruled, the kind sold at any office supply store. Leonard had used 11 of them. The first volume was at the front of the stack she had carried from the workshop, and it was dated in his handwriting inside the front cover. Volume 1, March 1994 through October 1997. Each entry followed the same structure. A date, a designation code she did not yet understand, a sequence of letters and numbers, a brief physical description, an acquisition note, and a row of numbers she had no reference point for. She read the first entry. March 14, 1994. Unit 001. 1929 Bugatti Type 41 Royale. Chassis 41111. Berlin de Voyage coachwork by Kellner. Acquired from the Beaumont Estate, Lyon, France, via private broker. Documentation, factory record, original title, pre-war registration, 2 owner letters. Condition at acquisition, complete, non-running. Condition at present, complete, running. She read it twice. Then she read it a third time. She did not know enough to understand it. She knew the word Bugatti the way most people knew it, as a name associated with very expensive and very rare automobiles. She did not know what a Type 41 Royale was. She did not know what Chassis 41111 meant. She did not know what Kellner coachwork was. She opened Caleb's phone, which he had left on the kitchen table when he went to bed, and searched. Bugatti Type 41 Royale. The first result was an encyclopedia entry. She read it standing over the table with the phone in one hand and the mug in the other. The Bugatti Type 41, known as the Royale, was the largest and most expensive automobile built in the early 20th century. Ettore Bugatti intended to build 25. He built 6. Of those 6, all still existed, held in major museums and private collections around the world, each one considered among the most significant and valuable automobiles in history. The most recent sale of a Royale, in 1987, had realized approximately $15 million at auction. Adjusted for inflation and current market demand, the value of an authenticated Royale in good condition was estimated between $30 and $45 million. She set the phone down. She picked it back up and read the entry again. She opened volume I to the second entry. April 2nd, 1994. Unit 002. 1962 Ferrari 250 GTO, chassis 3589 GT. Acquired from a private seller in Medina via intermediary. Documentation, factory record, original logbook, FIA homologation paperwork, period race photographs, NART entry records 1963 to 1964. Condition at acquisition, complete, running, surface oxidation to bodywork. Condition at present, complete, running, bodywork restored to period specification. She searched for that one too. She sat down hard in the kitchen chair. The Ferrari 250 GTO was the most valuable car ever sold at public auction. A single example had sold for $70 million in 2018. Before that, a private transaction in 2013 was reported at $52 million, a figure considered reliable by automotive historians. There were 36 GTOs in existence, and each sale set or approached new records. They were not simply cars. They were considered objects of art, mechanical achievements of a precision and beauty that the industry had never reproduced. Leonard had 2 of them. She could see from the first entries that Unit 003 was a 1936 Mercedes-Benz 540K Special Roadster. Unit 004 was a 1938 Talbot Lego T150 CSS, the body style known as the Teardrop, one of 7 known to exist. Unit 005 was a 1929 Duesenberg Model J with Murphy coachwork, acquired from a Pasadena estate for $9,000 in 1999. Unit 006 was a 1904 Panhard E.T. Levasseur, one of 4 surviving examples of that specific configuration. She read Unit 007 and stopped. A 1934 Packard 12 Individual Custom, coachwork by Brunn, acquired from an attorney's estate in Hartford, Connecticut, in 2001. The logbook note on the acquisition said the attorney's children had no idea what they were selling and had advertised it in a local newspaper as a vintage car, asking price $600. Leonard had paid the asking price and spent the drive home shaking. She had read that line 3 times, spent the drive home shaking. It was the only emotional notation in the first 7 entries. It was the only place Leonard Vance had allowed his professional composure to slip on the page. She thought about what it meant. She thought about a man in his late 40s, driving east through the Palouse in a borrowed trailer, knowing what he had behind him, unable to fully contain what that knowing felt like. She understood the feeling. She was sitting at his kitchen table at midnight having approximately the same experience. She stopped reading after the 9th entry because her hands had started to shake, and she did not want to spill the tea on the logbook. She sat in Leonard's kitchen with the bare bulb overhead and the cold seeping in around the old window frames and looked at the ceiling for a long time. She listened to the farmhouse make its nighttime sounds. She thought about the eviction notice in her jacket pocket. She thought about $261 in her checking account. She thought about the Honda with its cracked engine mount parked outside on the gravel. She thought about her father walking that path across the frozen grass every morning for 30 years. She did not sleep much. She was back at the kitchen table by 5:30 with the logbook and Caleb's phone, working through the entries methodically, one at a time, cross-referencing each unit designation with whatever she could find online. Some of the cars she found records of immediately. Others returned no results, which she eventually understood meant that Leonard had acquired vehicles the collecting world either did not know existed or had long since written off as lost. By the time Caleb appeared in the kitchen doorway at 7:30, hair compressed on one side from sleeping, She had worked through 14 entries in the first volume alone. "How many are there?" he asked. He had understood immediately, before she explained anything, simply by looking at her face. She told him she did not know yet. She told him to eat something. Margaret arrived at 9 with bolt cutters in the bed of her Subaru and a thermos of coffee she pressed into Nora's hands without preamble. She looked at Nora's face the way people looked at faces when they were trying to determine whether the news had been good or catastrophic, both of which could produce the same expression. "I've been reading," Nora said. She showed Margaret the first 4 entries in the logbook and then, after a pause, the entry about the Packard and the attorney's children and Leonard's hands shaking on the drive home. Margaret read them standing at the kitchen table with her reading glasses pushed up to her nose, her lips moving slightly. She read slowly, the way a person read when they understood that each word was specific and chosen. When she finished, she set the logbook down. She took her glasses off. She held them by one temple and looked at Nora. "Lord in heaven," Margaret said. Then, quietly, more to herself than to Nora, "He never said a word. Not once in 15 years. Nora asked if she was surprised. Margaret thought about it. She said no, not exactly. She said Leonard had always had the quality of a person carrying something large and private, and that she had assumed it was grief or guilt or one of the other weights men of that generation tended to carry without describing. She said she had not expected it to be this. She was not sure what she had expected. She said she supposed no one ever expected a building full of the most important cars in North America sitting behind a locked door in a wheat field in eastern Washington. They walked to the workshop together, the 3 of them, in the cold morning with frost still on the grass and the pale light of November spreading flat across the Palouse. Their breath came out in clouds. No one spoke. The climate control hummed at the roofline of the building when they came close, the low regular sound of a system doing exactly what it was designed to do. Margaret worked the bolt cutters on the rusted section of the chain in 2 cuts. The chain fell away and struck the concrete apron in front of the garage door with a sound that rang out across the quiet field. The garage door had a manual release handle on the interior side, accessible through the small side door they had found the day before. Nora went through and found it in the light of Caleb's phone, a cord hanging from the track mechanism, orange handle, standard. She pulled it. She pushed the door up from inside, and it rolled on its track with the smoothness of a mechanism regularly maintained, rising above her head and then above the roofline and letting in the November morning all at once. She had not known what to expect from that light. She had been inside with a phone flashlight and she had seen shapes in darkness and the approximate scale of the space. She had counted tarps and read 4 entries in a logbook and spent most of the night online, and she had thought she was prepared. She was not prepared. The light came in at a low November angle and traveled the full depth of the building and lit everything it touched with the particular quality of winter morning light in eastern Washington, clear and cold and without illusion. It lit the polished hardwood floor. It lit the rows of covered shapes. It lit the pegboard on the west wall with its labeled tools and the workbench and the stacked volumes of the logbook and the high concrete ceiling and the bricked-over windows and the door of the climate room at the very back. It also lit, in the first row nearest the door, the one tarp that had shifted at some point and slipped a few inches down the flank of what it was covering. A fender, dark blue, almost black in the low light, with a curve to it that was neither aggressive nor timid, but something more precise than either of those words. A curve that had been arrived at through calculation and art simultaneously. The exposed metal was clean. No oxidation. No surface deterioration. Whatever it had been stored in, the condition had been maintained. Margaret made a small sound behind her. Caleb went forward without being asked, moving between the first 2 rows with his hands careful at his sides, not touching anything, simply looking. He walked the full length of the first row and came back and looked at Nora. "There are stairs in the back," he said. "There's another level." She had not seen stairs. She filed this away. She reached the first tarp and took the edge of it in both hands and pulled it back slowly, lifting it over and folding it off the car the way you took a bandage off something that might or might not be healed underneath. The canvas was heavy, well-made, the kind sewn for this purpose rather than bought off a shelf. The car underneath was dark blue, a blue so deep it was almost a philosophical position on the subject of color. The bodywork ran long and low, the hood extending far ahead of the windscreen in the proportion of a different era, an era when speed was not yet fully understood and beauty and function had arrived at the same conclusions by different routes. The headlights were mounted on the front fenders on chrome stanchions, round, unadorned, practical as eyes. The grille was horseshoe-shaped, the Bugatti horseshoe, a form she now recognized from the photographs that had appeared in every search result the night before. She walked around it slowly. The coachwork was intact. No cracks, no splits in the leather interior that she could see through the window glass. 4 doors, unusual for a car of this era and this provenance, the Berlin de Voyage body style that the logbook had specified. The chrome was present and undiminished. The tires were new, a period-correct fitment, installed at some point during Leonard's stewardship. The license plate was a French registration from 1932. Nora looked at it for a long time. She looked at it the way you looked at something when you were trying to make it real, when the fact of a thing and the sight of it were still not quite reconciled. Margaret came and stood beside her. Is this what I think it is? I think so. One of 6 in the world. One of 6. They uncovered 4 more cars that morning, working methodically from the front of the building toward the back, pulling tarps and folding them, and setting them aside, and standing before whatever was revealed. A cream and black Mercedes-Benz with a supercharged engine that Caleb could start, just briefly, by locating the switch on the dash while Nora held the logbook entry open to the maintenance notes that said it ran and had been run monthly. The sound it made, that 8-cylinder supercharged note, filled the building for 30 seconds before she told Caleb to shut it off, and in the silence afterward all 3 of them stood listening to the echo. A Talbot Lego, silver gray, with a body that had no straight line on it anywhere, all curve and motion, a shape that looked impossible until you understood that the designer had taken the physics of moving air and made it visible. One of 7 of this body style in the world, the logbook said. This one had raced at Le Mans in 1939. A 1904 Panhard E.T. Levasseur, early enough to be more sculpture than vehicle, with a tiller instead of a wheel and a body made of wood and brass and coachmaker's intuition. Leonard's entry noted it was one of 4 surviving examples of this specific configuration. A Duesenberg Model J, midnight black, with coachwork by Murphy, the length of a small boat, the chrome blinding even in the November light. The logbook entry ran to half a page. Leonard had acquired it from an estate in Pasadena in 1999, the family unaware of what they had. He had paid $9,000 for it at a private sale. He had spent 3 months researching its provenance before writing the entry, and at the bottom of the entry, in a notation added later in slightly different ink, he had written, "Confirmed original. Factory documentation complete. Chassis 2265, Murphy coachwork, 1 known survivor." By noon they had pulled 11 tarps. Nora sat on the concrete apron outside the open garage door with the logbook in her lap and the cold coming through her jacket and did the math she could do, which was not precise and would not be precise until people who knew far more than she did walked through this building with their credentials and their equipment. She knew the Royale. She knew the GTO, which she had not yet uncovered but was listed as Unit 002. She knew the rough valuations she had found online for the cars she could identify, and she knew that every estimate she had seen applied to vehicles in conditions that did not account for provenance documentation at this level of completeness. The logbook contained 47 numbered entries. She had worked through the first 14. She had no reference point for many of them yet, but the ones she could price, conservatively, using the most modest figures she could find, already totaled more than $90 million. She set the logbook down on the concrete beside her. She called her mother. Gail answered on the second ring with the immediate alertness of a woman who had spent 40 years answering phones and knowing that a call at noon on a Sunday from her daughter meant something. Nora said, "Mom, I'm at Dad's place in Colfax." Gail said, "I know. I figured you'd go." Nora said, "I need to tell you something." She told her everything, starting with the logbook entry she had read the night before and ending with the 11 tarps she had pulled that morning. She spoke carefully and with specifics, the way she had learned to speak when the thing she was describing was so large that vagueness made it sound invented. Gail listened without interrupting. When Nora finished, the phone was quiet for a moment. Then Gail said, "Your father could have mentioned this." Nora said, "Yeah." Another pause. When Gail spoke again, Her voice had the quality it got when she was organizing something complicated into its component parts. She said, "You need a professional. Not a car dealer. Not an auctioneer. A conservator. Someone who can tell you exactly what you have before anyone else finds out you have it." Nora already knew this, but hearing it from Gail made it feel actionable. She went back inside and spent the afternoon working through the middle of the building while Caleb moved ahead of her with a flashlight, calling back descriptions she wrote in the margins of the logbook beside the entries. The Ferrari GTO was in the 5th position, driver's side of row 2, covered in a red tarp that had faded to something closer to orange. She pulled the tarp alone. She stood in front of the car for a full minute before she wrote anything. It was red. The specific red that Ferrari had used in the early 60s, a shade that photography from that era had never quite captured, but that every automotive historian described in the same way, more alive than the photograph suggested. The body was open, a berlinetta, with the particular proportion of a car designed to race, but made by hand. Each panel shaped individually. No two 250 GTOs exactly alike. The left front fender had a small crease at the lower edge, a racing scar, documented in the logbook with a photograph clipped to the page showing the same car at a 1964 event in Sebring. The crease visible in the period photograph, the provenance of the imperfection confirmed. Leonard had not repaired it. She understood that. He had understood, in the way that serious people understood things, that the crease was not a flaw. It was a document. By mid-afternoon, she had catalogued 22 vehicles. Motorcycles occupied the eastern wall in a row of their own. A 1915 Indian V-twin, a 1929 Broth Superior SS-100, 3 pre-war German machines she could not yet identify, but whose logbook entries ran long with precision and conviction. Aircraft parts in one corner. What appeared to be the original engine from a 1918 SPAD-13 fighter, fully documented, suspended on a custom cradle. 2 scale models under separate tarps. Mechanical scale replicas of ships' engines built in the 19th century as engineering demonstration pieces, the logbook noting they were the work of a Scottish firm and had been exhibited at the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. She had been so focused on the vehicles that she had not moved past row 5. Row 6 stopped her. The tarps here were different. Smaller, covering objects on waist-high tables rather than floor-level vehicles. She lifted the nearest one. A figure sat on a velvet-covered base behind glass, enclosed in a case that Leonard had built for it, a rectangular case of quarter-inch plate glass with mahogany trim. The figure was perhaps 18 inches high, dressed in the clothing of the late 18th century, a gentleman's coat of silk, fitted and perfectly preserved, with articulated hands positioned over a small writing desk. The face was ivory, the eyes made of enamel, the hair human and dressed in a style from a different century. She understood she was looking at an automaton. She had seen the word before in the context of robots and automation, without fully registering its historical meaning. What she was looking at was a mechanical figure, hand-built in an era before electricity, designed to simulate human action through the precision of gears and cams and levers. These had been made in the workshops of French and Swiss craftsmen in the 18th and 19th centuries. They had been sold to the courts and curiosity cabinets of Europe. The finest examples, made by makers like Pierre Jacquet-Dras and his son Henri Louis, had survived the centuries and now lived in museums. The draftsman, the writer, the musician, 3 surviving pieces by the elder Jacquet-Dras were in the Musée d'Art et d'Histoire in Neuchâtel, Switzerland, and had never been for sale. The logbook entry for this figure, which Leonard had designated Unit 031, noted its attribution to a follower of the Jacquet-Dras workshop, circa 1785, acquired from a private European collection in 2003. The entry included a handwritten note from an expert in Neuchâtel confirming the attribution and the completeness of the mechanism. It functioned. Leonard had wound it and observed its operation as recently as 2021. Estimated value at that time, the note said, per the Swiss expert, between $4 and $7 million, pending formal auction assessment. Nora counted the tables in row 6. 17 automata. She sat on the stool that Leonard had kept in this section, a plain wooden stool, practical, and held the logbook and looked at the row of glass cases and understood something about her father that she had not understood before. He had not been collecting wealth. He had been collecting proof. Proof that human beings at their most deliberate and patient and gifted could make things that lasted. Things that still worked after 2 centuries because the people who built them had cared enough to get it right. He had been drawn to objects that refused to stop working. She thought about the sewing machine at Hartwell's quilting in the story her grandmother used to tell. She pulled that thought back. It was her own life she was in, her own story. She thought about Caleb instead, about who he would be when he understood what this meant. She thought about the eviction notice and the Honda and the $60 her grandmother's bracelet had brought at a consignment shop. She thought about her father, alone, walking this path. Every morning for 30 years. In the back of the building, behind the last row of vehicles and behind the table-mounted automata, there was a wall she had assumed was the rear of the structure. There was a door set into it. A standard interior door, not the heavy mahogany of the side entry, just a hollow core door with a plain knob. Caleb found it by walking the perimeter while Nora was cataloging. It was unlocked. The room beyond was smaller, perhaps 20 feet by 20 feet, with the same hardwood floor and the same high ceiling and its own independent climate control unit humming in the corner, a unit newer and more sophisticated than the main building system. The walls were shelved, floor to ceiling on 3 sides, the shelves occupied by objects she had no immediate context for. They were small. Most fit on a single shelf. They were made of wood and brass and iron and glass, and they were mechanisms, working mechanical models of things. She could identify some of them by shape and general function. A loom mechanism, perfectly scaled, every component present and articulated. A steam engine, boiler and cylinder and flywheel, small enough to hold in 2 hands. A printing press with movable type. A reaping mechanism, a threshing mechanism, a pump. A mechanical calculator with numbered wheels and gear trains. She picked up the calculator. It was dense in her hand, heavier than it looked. On the base, engraved into the wood, was a number, 52,847. Below the number, a date, 1872. Below the date, the words, submitted to the United States Patent Office in conformity with law. She stood very still. She searched Caleb's phone for patent models, USPTO. The Patent Office Model Collection. The United States Patent Office had required, from the nation's founding until 1880, that inventors submit a working mechanical model along with every patent application. These models were built by inventors or professional model makers to demonstrate that the invention actually functioned as described. At its peak, the collection held over 200,000 models in a dedicated building in Washington. In 1877, a fire destroyed a warehouse holding a significant portion of the collection. The remainder survived but was eventually deemed too costly to maintain and was dispersed, some to the Smithsonian, some to other institutions, a large portion sold at government auction in the early 20th century to private buyers, and much of what had been sold then had subsequently vanished from the historical record. Scholars of American technological history had spent generations trying to locate the lost models. A few had surfaced at estate sales over the decades, individual pieces identified by chance. A collection of any size was considered beyond recovery. She stood in the climate room with Caleb's phone in her hand and looked at the shelves for a long time without moving. These were not museum pieces displayed behind glass. They were objects made by specific people in specific years for the purpose of demonstrating to the government that their ideas were real. A man in 1867 had sat at a workbench somewhere and built the small steam engine she was looking at now, had measured the tolerances and fitted the parts and submitted it along with his application. And it had sat in a government warehouse and survived a fire and passed through an auction and ended up in the estate of a collector in Annapolis who did not fully understand what he had. And then Leonard had paid $12,000 for all of them in 2006 and brought them to a wheat field in Eastern Washington and put them in a climate-controlled room and never told a single person. She picked up the mechanical loom. It was dense and precise, the kind of object built by someone who understood exactly how the mechanism worked because they had invented it. She set it back carefully. She looked at the shelves. She began counting methodically, row by row, shelf by shelf. She stopped counting at 200. There were more. She went back to the logbook. Volume 6, which covered acquisitions from 2005 through 2009, had an entry that read only, Patent Model Collection, 247 items, acquired through private estate sale, Annapolis, Maryland, 2006. Provenance: estate of collector R. Mallory, who acquired at government dispersal sale, 1926. Documentation: original USPTO submission papers for 231 of 247 items. Condition: all functional. Storage: climate room, rear of main structure. The acquisition price Leonard had paid for all 247 patent models, at a private estate sale where no one else understood what they were looking at, was $12,000. She thought about the developer from Pullman and his $45,000 offer. She thought about Derek's voice on the phone, the careful brightness of it, saying probably just old tools and scrap metal. She closed the logbook carefully. She stood in the climate room with its 247 patent models and looked at the shelves. These were the physical records of American invention, not photographs or drawings. The actual models, built by the inventors themselves or under their direct supervision, submitted to the government as proof that the thing worked. She did not know what they were worth. She was not sure anyone did, because a collection of this size and provenance had never come to market. She went back into the main building. Caleb was sitting cross-legged on the hardwood floor near the Dwessenberg, reading from Volume 3 of the logbook with the focused expression she recognized from homework sessions at the kitchen table at Creekside Gardens. He did not look up. She went to the open garage door and stood in the afternoon light and called Margaret, who was sitting in her Subaru on the gravel track where she had been for the last hour giving Nora space. "I need you to find me someone," Nora said. "Expert. The kind of person who knows what these things are worth. Someone I can trust." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know exactly who to call." Her name was Dr. Sarah Crane. Margaret had known her for years through a chain of connections specific to the Palouse, where everyone knew everyone through 2 or 3 links at most. Sarah Crane had grown up in Pullman, gone east for her doctorate in art history with a specialization in mechanical objects, and spent 20 years moving between institutions and private practices before settling into the work she was built for: authentication and valuation of rare vehicles and mechanical artifacts for auction houses, museums, and private collections. She was based in Seattle. Margaret had once processed her family's charitable donation paperwork through a local foundation. Margaret called her on Thursday afternoon. Sarah Crane answered on the second ring. She did not ask many questions. She asked for a description of the first logbook entry, which Nora read to her on speaker while Margaret and Caleb sat at the kitchen table and listened. There was silence on the other end for a full 4 or 5 seconds. Then Sarah Crane said, "We're exactly in Eastern Washington." She arrived the following morning at 7:30, driving a gray Volvo with a cracked windshield and 2 bags of professional equipment in the back seat, one of which contained a laptop, a portable light, and a set of inspection tools, and the other of which appeared to hold paperwork organized in a system that only she understood. She was 51, compact and direct, with the organized efficiency of someone who had spent her career walking into rooms full of objects and knowing immediately what she was looking at. She shook Nora's hand on the farmhouse porch with the businesslike warmth of a person who respected the situation without wanting to make a production of it. She accepted the coffee Nora offered, held it, and said, "Show me the building." Nora opened the main garage door and stood back. Sarah Crane walked in. She did not speak for the first 5 minutes. She walked the length of the first row without touching anything, her eyes moving across each covered shape with the systematic deliberation of someone doing an inventory rather than a tour. Then she walked the second row in the same way. Then she went back to the beginning and started again, this time removing a small flashlight from her jacket and shining it along the underside of each tarp at floor level. At the Talbot Lego, which Nora had left uncovered, she stopped. She crouched and looked at the underside of the body from the front, then at the engine bay through the louved hood. She straightened and looked at the door sill. She said nothing. At the Bugatti Royale, she stopped for a longer time. She walked around it twice. She knelt at the rear and studied the chassis plate. She opened the driver's door and leaned in without touching the leather interior, examining something on the steering column with the flashlight. She straightened up. "Is this what I think it is?" Nora asked. Sarah Crane said, "If the documentation is what I expect it to be, this is chassis 41111, the Kellner Berlin de Voyage body. It was reported acquired by a German collector in 1937 and then lost during the war. The collecting world has considered it unaccounted for since 1946. She said it in the same tone she might have used to read an address aloud. Factual. Confirmed. The shock of it lived entirely beneath the surface. She walked to the Ferrari. She stood in front of it for a long time. She photographed the chassis plate. She photographed the crease on the left front fender, and then found the period photograph clipped inside the logbook and held it beside the car. She looked back and forth 3 times. She came back to Nora. "May I see the logbook?" Nora handed her volume 1. Sarah Crane stood in the middle of the building and read. She read for 20 minutes without moving. Then she handed the volume back. Nora asked, "Can you tell me what any of this is worth?" Sarah Crane looked at the open garage door, at the November light falling across the hardwood floor and the rows of covered shapes extending toward the back of the building. She said, "I need to see everything. All of it. Before I say a number, I need to walk every row and examine every piece and review every volume of that logbook." Nora said, "How long will that take?" Sarah Crane looked at the building. She looked at it the way you looked at something when you were recalculating the scope of a job. 2 days minimum, she said. Possibly 3. And that's for a preliminary assessment. A full authentication and appraisal, the kind that stands up to scrutiny in a legal or auction context, will take months and require additional specialists. She said it without drama, the way she would have said it about any job. But there was something beneath the professional composure, something Nora caught in the brief moment before Sarah Crane turned back to the building. A quality she could only describe as the look of someone who was working very hard to remain calibrated when everything in them wanted to stop being calibrated. 2 days later, on a Thursday morning, Sarah Crane sat at Leonard's kitchen table with her own notes spread in front of her and both of her equipment bags open on the floor and a second coffee from the thermos Margaret had brought, which she was drinking this time. Nora sat across from her. Caleb was in the farmhouse living room, reading, within earshot. Margaret was in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed. Sarah Crane had spent 2 full days in the building. She had photographed every item. She had examined chassis plates, body numbers, interior materials, mechanical components. She had made calls to 3 colleagues in different time zones, one in London who specialized in pre-war European coachwork, one in Stuttgart with particular expertise in Mercedes-Benz mechanical history, one in New York who had spent 20 years handling Ferrari provenance disputes for major auction houses. She had spent half of Wednesday night on her laptop cross-referencing provenance documents against auction records and museum acquisition histories. She had also, on the second afternoon, done something that had left Nora standing in the doorway of the workshop watching in silence. She had started one of the cars, not the Royale, which she treated with the care of a conservator working in a museum context, not the GTO, which she had examined with a formality close to reverence, but the Duesenberg, the Murphy-bodied Model J, which Leonard's maintenance notes said had been run monthly. Sarah Crane had located the battery tender connection on the right side of the engine bay, had confirmed charge, had checked the oil and the coolant from the notes Leonard had left clipped inside the driver's door, and had started the engine. The sound it made was not the sound of a machine. It was the sound of an argument from an earlier century about what engines were capable of, 8 cylinders in a configuration designed by engineers who were trying to build the finest road car the world had ever seen. It ran for 3 minutes in the building while the November air outside carried nothing but cold and wheat stubble smell and the distant sound of a hawk. Then Sarah Crane had switched it off and written something in her notebook. Now she sat at Leonard's kitchen table and said, "I want to be very clear that what I am going to tell you is preliminary. It is based on 2 days of examination, not the full authentication process. Some of these numbers will change. Some of them will change significantly when proper authentication is complete. Some may go up and some may go down, and I cannot predict the balance of those outcomes yet." Nora said she understood. Sarah Crane said, "The vehicle collection contains 47 items. Of those, I can provisionally attribute 39 to specific makes, models, and documented chassis. The remaining 8 require additional research and specialist input that I have already initiated. Of the 39 I can provisionally assess, I believe the collection contains at minimum 4 vehicles of extraordinary historical significance. The Royale, the GTO, and 2 others I have not yet discussed with you." She paused. "The 1938 Talbot Lego T150 CSS," she said, is one of 3 surviving examples of the Figoni et Falaschi teardrop coachwork. The third survivor has been in private hands since 1952 and has not appeared on any auction record. It is not the one in the Mullen Automotive Museum. It is not the one that sold in Monterey in 2005. The existence of a fourth example, in this condition, with this documentation, is something that will cause significant discussion in the field. Nora said, "What does significant discussion mean in terms of value?" Sarah Crane said, "Conservatively, 12 to 18 million. If a motivated buyer is present at auction, considerably more." She turned a page in her notes. "The 1929 Duesenberg Model J with Murphy coachwork," she said, "is more complicated. There are many Model JS and many Murphy bodies. What Leonard has here is a documented survivor of a specific chassis and body combination that Murphy's own records list as having been completed for a specific client in 1929, delivered, and then disposed of in an estate sale in 1944. After that, the trail went cold. The collecting community has assumed it was either scrapped or substantially modified beyond recognition. It has not been." She looked up. The last auction sale of a comparable documented Murphy-bodied Model J was $11 million. She closed her notes for a moment and looked at the table. Nora waited. "The automata," Sarah Crane said, "are outside my primary expertise, but I have spoken with a colleague in Paris who specializes in this area and who has agreed to examine photographs and initial documentation. My preliminary view, based on logbook entries and the 2 examples I was able to examine in detail, is that the collection contains at least 3 pieces of significant museum quality and several more of substantial interest." My colleague's initial estimate, which she stressed was very preliminary, for the collection as a whole, was between $40 and $70 million. She said the patent models were the item she felt least qualified to assess on a short timeline, but that she had reached a colleague at the Smithsonian who had spent the previous night reviewing photographs and had asked to visit the property in person at the earliest possible date. Her colleague had used the phrase "genuinely significant." She had said it more than once. Nora said, "I need a number. I understand it's preliminary. I understand it will change. I need a number I can hold on to." Sarah Crane looked at her for a moment. She said, "I believe this collection, taken in its entirety, represents a minimum valuation of $200 million. That number is based on the most conservative auction comps I can find for the items I have been able to provisionally assess, and it does not account for the patent model collection, for which I cannot yet produce a reliable figure, and it does not account for auction premium or the potential of motivated buyers in the case of the historically significant vehicles." "The word minimum," she said, "is doing a great deal of work in that sentence." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. The bare bulb hummed overhead. Outside, the Palouse stretched away in all directions under a November sky that was pressing down with the comfortable permanence of winter arriving. Nora said, $200 million. Sarah Crane said, "At minimum." "Yes." Margaret made a sound from the doorway. It was not a word. It was just a sound. Caleb appeared in the kitchen, book still in his hand, and looked at his mother's face. He said, "That's a lot, isn't it?" Nora looked at her son, at the library book about deep-sea creatures in his hand, at the gap in his sneaker where the sole had started to separate at the toe, and she had been putting off replacing them until the finances allowed. "Yes," she said, "that's a lot." She sat with that for a moment, just a moment longer than a moment. She thought about Leonard. She thought about what it had cost him, not in money but in time and solitude, to spend 30 years in that building. He had lived in the farmhouse, but he had lived in the workshop. He had eaten his meals alone and driven to town for supplies, and paid his bills with the ordinary discipline of a person whose life looked ordinary from the outside. He had not come to her when Caleb was born, not really, not in any way that counted. He had not made the call she had needed him to make. He had been here, in the Palouse, walking that frost-covered path every morning to a building no one else could enter. She had spent years believing the workshop was what he had chosen instead of her. Sitting in his kitchen now, she was not sure anymore. The letter he had left said, "Everything I want to say to you is inside that building." She had taken that as a practical instruction. Come and see it. Open it before you sell it. She had been right about that reading, but she thought he had meant something more, something she was only now beginning to approach. He had not been able to say the things that needed saying. He was the kind of man who had been formed, or broken, or simply built in a way that kept the most important things internal, that made him reach for a wrench when other people would have reached for words. So he had done the only thing he knew how to do instead. He had built something. He had spent 30 years building it, item by item, entry by entry in the logbook, and he had put her name on the door and left the key on a leather cord and trusted that the time would come and that she would find it. He had been right about the time. He had been right about her. She thought about Caleb in the living room with his library book, the book about creatures that lived in the dark and found ways to make their own light. She thought about what it would mean for him to know his grandfather had been building something all along, that it had been sealed and patient in a wheat field waiting for them, that the story was not one of abandonment, but of something harder and stranger and more human than abandonment. She did not yet know how to tell that story to a 9-year-old. She would figure it out. She took out her phone and found Thomas Birch's number in her recent calls. She needed a lawyer. She needed one before the developer from Pullman heard anything, before Derek found out, before anyone else with an interest in this property had time to organize themselves. She had 47 vehicles and 17 automata and 247 patent models in a concrete building on 3 acres of eastern Washington land that she had inherited from a man she had not spoken to in 6 years, and the only number she had for it, the most conservative number anyone with any expertise had put on it, was $200 million. She had 60 days on an eviction notice. She had $261 in her checking account. And she had something her father had spent 30 years building for her in a sealed building in a wheat field, patient as the hills around it, waiting for the time to be right. She pressed call. Birch answered on the 3rd ring. His voice had the alert quality of a man who kept his phone nearby even in the evenings, which was either a professional habit or a sign of a life that had never fully separated from work. Nora told him what she needed, and then, when he did not immediately respond, she told him why. She said it the way she had said it to Sarah Crane, carefully, with specifics, starting with the logbook entry for Unit 001 and ending with the preliminary figure that had been sitting on the kitchen table all afternoon like an object she could not pick up. $200 million. Minimum. Before the patent models were assessed. Birch was quiet for a moment. She heard him exhale slowly. He said, "Miss Vance, I need you to secure the property tonight. Change the padlock on the main door to something that has not been copied. Do not tell anyone else what you've found. I will be there first thing in the morning, and we will talk about what happens next." She asked, "What has happened next?" He said, "First we protect it. Then we understand it. Then we decide what to do with it. In that order, not the other way around." He arrived at 8 the next morning with a leather briefcase and a locksmith from Colfax who changed the main door padlock to a Medico commercial-grade cylinder in 20 minutes and handed Nora 2 keys and kept none. Birch sat at Leonard's kitchen table with his paperwork and his coffee and went through the estate documents in the precise and unhurried way of someone who had been practicing law for 30 years and understood that precision was its own form of speed. The will was clean. Leonard had used a different attorney from Olympia to draft it 6 years ago, a firm that specialized in estates with unconventional assets, which Birch noted now made complete sense. The language was specific and deliberate. The workshop structure, its contents in entirety, and the 3 acres of land on which it stood were the sole inheritance of Nora Vance, daughter of the deceased. No codicils, no conditions, no provisions for contestation beyond the standard statutory period, which had already passed. The estate was settled. Birch said, "Your brother cannot challenge this. The will is properly executed and witnessed, and the statutory period for contest has elapsed. What you have in that building is yours, fully and without condition." She thanked him, and meant it more than she had ever meant a thank you in a professional context. Derek called that afternoon. She had expected him to call. She had been thinking about how to handle it since the previous morning and had not arrived at a satisfying answer. So when his number appeared on the screen, she answered without having one. His voice was not angry, which she had also expected. It was controlled in the specific way of someone managing anger because they had decided that anger was not useful right now. He said, "I heard from Birch." She said, "I thought you might." He said, "He told me there was more to the estate than was understood at the time of probate. That you've had experts out there." She said, "Yes." A pause, longer than his usual ones. He said, "How much more?" She told him. She said it directly, without softening it, because she had learned in 38 years that there was no kind way to deliver a number that large, and that the effort to make it kind only made it stranger. He was quiet for a full 10 seconds. She counted. Then he said, "He left you all of it." She said, "Yes." He said, "I was there every year. I drove down twice a year for 20 years. I sat at that kitchen table and I talked to him about fishing and farming prices and the weather and whatever else he wanted to talk about. I showed up. You stopped calling." She said, "I know." He said, "And he left it all to you." She said, "He left you the house and the truck and the savings. He left me the workshop. He knew what was in it. He knew what he was doing." Another pause. He said, "That doesn't feel fair." She said, "I know it doesn't." She did not say what she wanted to say, which was that maybe Leonard had believed Derek would sell it without understanding it, the way Derek had immediately recommended selling without seeing it. She did not say that Leonard had perhaps known, in the way parents sometimes knew things without being told, that Nora was the one who would stop instead of selling. She did not say any of this because it would not help and because she was not certain enough of it to use it as an argument. She said instead, "I don't know what he was thinking. I've been trying to understand it for 3 days, and I'm not there yet. But I'd like you to come out and see it when I've got things a little more organized. I'd like you to understand what was in there." Derek said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Was it worth more than what I got?" The question had the quality of something he had been working up to since the beginning of the call. She thought about how to answer it honestly. She thought about the $200 million preliminary figure. She thought about the $14,000 in the savings account and the farmhouse that would sell in a market where farmhouses in eastern Washington moved slowly and for modest prices. She said, "Yes, considerably more." He said, "And you knew this when we talked. When I told you about the developer." She said, "I didn't know yet. I went to see it because of the letter he left. The developer's offer was real when I turned it down. I didn't know what was in there until after." A longer pause. He said, "I'm not sure I believe that." She said, "I know, but it's true." She waited. She had learned, in her years managing difficult conversations across a diner counter and across the kitchen table from her son when something was hard, that waiting was more useful than filling. Derek said, "I'll think about coming out." She said, "Take your time." He hung up, and she sat with the phone in her hand and thought about her brother, who had shown up every year for 20 years to sit at a table with a man who had not told him what was in the building a quarter-mile across the field. She thought about what that cost a person. She was not the only one who had been failed by Leonard's silence. She was just the one who had been left the thing he could not say, which made her the winner in the material sense and did not make everything simple. The developer called 2 days later, on a Tuesday morning while Nora was reviewing Volume 4 of the logbook in the farmhouse kitchen. His name was Gary Pell. She had not spoken to him directly before, only heard about him through Derek and through Birch's preliminary conversations about the estate. His voice had the particular quality of a man who had made a great many offers and was accustomed to one of them eventually landing. He said he understood she was exploring her options. He said he had heard there might be some items of interest in the estate property. He said he wanted to revisit his offer. He said he was prepared to go to $250,000, which he said was a very generous number for 3 acres of raw agricultural land in eastern Washington, and that he thought they could make a clean and fast transaction that would benefit them both. $250,000. She thanked him. She told him the property was not available. He said, "Miss Vance, I want to be straightforward with you. The development corridor in this area is moving fast and land values will not stay where they are indefinitely. I'd encourage you to think carefully about whether holding is in your best interest." She said, "I appreciate that. The property is not for sale." He said, "May I ask what your plans are?" She said, "Not yet, but thank you for calling." She hung up and went back to the logbook. Birch had been making calls of his own, the kind of calls that did not appear in any written record, but that connected the situation to the right people in the right sequence. He had a colleague in Seattle who handled art and collectibles law. That colleague had a contact at Christie's in New York. The Christie's contact had a relationship with the Department of Transportation's Historic Vehicle Registry in Washington, D.C., and with a former commissioner at the Smithsonian who now consulted independently. Birch moved through these connections in a week with the methodical efficiency of someone who had spent 30 years learning that the right call at the right time saved years of the wrong ones. By the time the news moved into the public domain, 6 weeks after Nora had first stood in the dark of the workshop counting tarps with a dying phone battery, she had legal protection on the property, a formal engagement letter with Christie's for the vehicle collection, a commitment from the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History for the patent models, a provisional agreement with 3 European institutions for the automata, and a 30-page preliminary report from Sarah Crane that used language like unprecedented and significant departure from the known historical record and once-in-a-generation find in a tone so controlled it was nearly medical. The story broke on a Thursday through the Spokane Spokesman Review, which ran it on the front page under a headline that was accurate but could not quite capture the scale of what it was describing. Margaret had introduced Nora to the journalist, a woman named Carol Foss who had covered Eastern Washington for 22 years and who had walked through the workshop with a camera and a notebook and the expression of someone who had been doing this work for a long time and had not expected something like this to be at the end of a gravel track outside Colfax. Nora had given Carol 2 hours in the building and had stood back and let her look. She had not prepared talking points or messaging. She had handed Carol a copy of the first logbook and let her read at her own pace. At the end of the 2 hours, Carol had looked up from the logbook and said, "Your father did all of this alone. In secret. For 30 years. And then he left it to a daughter he hadn't spoken to in 6 years." Nora had said, "Yes, that's the story." The piece ran 32 column inches with 5 photographs. It was measured and specific, exactly the way Nora had asked it to be. It named the vehicles, quoted Sarah Crane's preliminary figures, described the automata and the patent models. It ran a photograph of the Royale, of the Ferrari, of one of the automata in its glass case with the workshop's polished hardwood floor visible behind it. It ran the photograph of Nora at 9 years old on Leonard's lap in the unfinished building, which Carol had included with permission and which turned out to be the detail that lodged in people's memory when they shared the story. A 9-year-old girl, sitting in a building her father was about to seal for 30 years. Written on the back, "Before we close it up." By Friday afternoon, the piece had been picked up by the Associated Press. By Saturday morning, it was on the front page of the New York Times, with a reporter calling Birch's office every 20 minutes and 2 television crews parked at the end of the county road. The comments and messages came in the thousands. People who had never heard of a Bugatti Type 41 Royale or a Ferrari 250 GTO watched the news segments and felt something they could not quite name, which was the feeling of a story that made the world seem briefly larger than it had been before. People who had grown up in Eastern Washington texted the piece to their families with messages that said things like, "This happened 10 miles from where we grew up." People who collected things, who maintained things in workshops and garages and spare rooms without explaining the significance to the people around them, read the story and felt, some of them, a kind of recognition that they kept to themselves. Gary Pell, the developer from Pullman, sent a formal letter through his attorney that arrived on the Monday after the story broke. It contained an offer of $5 million for the 3 acres and the workshop structure, made with the aggressive optimism of someone who had read the coverage and concluded that a woman who had grown up without money might still be persuaded by a number large enough to feel life-changing. Birch responded in a single sentence that the property was not for sale at any price and that further contact should be directed to his office only. She never heard from Gary Pell again. The collecting world reacted the way it reacted when something this significant arrived unannounced, with the controlled excitement of people who were professionally required to remain calibrated while personally experiencing something they would describe for the rest of their careers. Sarah Crane's phone did not stop. Specialists in automotive history, in mechanical automata, in American patent history, sent emails and left messages and contacted Christie's through formal channels, requesting access, offering expertise, asking whether the rumors about the Royale were accurate. They were. The International Bugatti Registry confirmed chassis 41,111 within 48 hours of receiving Sarah Crane's documentation. The registry's president, a Swiss automotive historian named Franz Gerber, issued a statement that was careful and professional and still managed to communicate that he was sitting somewhere in Geneva in a state of significant astonishment. He said that the Kellner Berlin de Voyage body on chassis 41111 was the only Royale in unknown condition since 1946, and that its confirmation as intact and functional was, and here the press release used a word that automotive historians rarely used, extraordinary. The Ferrari Classish department in Maranello confirmed chassis 3589 GT the following week. Their report was 7 pages. The relevant sentence was on page 2. Condition consistent with the highest tier of Ferrari Red Book certification, with documented provenance of unusual completeness. The Smithsonian sent Dr. James Okafor, a curator from the National Museum of American History who specialized in industrial and technological artifacts, on a Monday in December. He arrived with 2 colleagues and spent 3 full days in the climate room with the kind of systematic focus she recognized from Sarah Crane and from Leonard's logbook entries. Methodical, thorough, the attention of someone for whom precision was not a discipline but a way of being. On the second afternoon, she brought him coffee and sat for a while on the stool Leonard had kept in the corner while Okafor worked. He moved along the shelves with a handheld camera and a notebook, cataloging each model in turn. He did not rush. He examined the base of each piece, where the USPTO submission number was engraved, and cross-referenced it with a printed list he carried folded in his coat pocket. When the number matched a model in his records, he made a notation. When it matched a model considered lost in the 1877 fire or in the subsequent dispersals, he made a different notation. The second category was longer. She watched him for a while and said, "How many of them did you think were gone?" He looked at the list. He said, "Of the models documented in the 1876 Patent Office inventory that are represented in this room, the historical consensus considered 112 of them destroyed or permanently lost. We have been building that consensus for 60 years, adjusting it downward every time one turned up at an estate sale somewhere." He looked at the shelf in front of him. He said, "We will have to rebuild the consensus entirely." On the third day, at the end of the afternoon, he came and found Nora sitting on the porch of the farmhouse and sat beside her in the cold without being invited and said nothing for almost a minute. Then he said, "We have been looking for a collection of this scale for 60 years. We had genuinely stopped expecting to find one." She asked, "What are they worth?" He said, "That question is more complicated for patent models than for vehicles, because there is no true auction precedent for a collection of this size and provenance. What I can tell you is that our preliminary estimate for acquisition, which our director has already authorized me to communicate, is $120 million. That is a public institution's number, which means it is conservative by nature. A private technology museum with a competitive interest would pay more." She said, "They belong in the Smithsonian." He looked at the building across the field for a moment. He said, "Yes, I think so too. And I think your father knew that, somehow. The way he maintained them, the documentation he kept, the care. He was preserving them for someone who would know what to do with them. He just did not know who that person was going to be." She thought about that for a while after he left. She thought it was probably the most accurate thing anyone had said about Leonard since the beginning of this. The formal appraisal process ran through the winter and into spring. Christie's assigned a team of 6 specialists to the vehicle collection. The automata went through independent assessment by the European institutions and by a specialist auction house in Geneva. The patent models were assessed jointly by the Smithsonian and an independent panel of American technology historians. The final figure was released in April, 8 months after Nora had driven a 2009 Honda with a cracked engine mount down the gravel track and found the Cedar sign with her name on it. The full appraisal, covering all categories, accounting for the institutional acquisitions already agreed upon and the vehicles proceeding to auction or direct sale, came to $485 million. Sarah Crane called to tell her. She said the number in the same level tone she had used for every number since the beginning. Nora thanked her and hung up and sat in the farmhouse kitchen that had been Leonard's kitchen for 30 years and looked at the bare bulb overhead. $485 million. She had inherited 3 acres of eastern Washington farmland and a concrete building from a man she had not spoken to in 6 years, and the building contained $485 million worth of the things her father had spent his life understanding and caring for. She was 38 years old, and she had $261 in her checking account on the day she drove down to see it. The eviction notice had been resolved in the first week. Birch had connected her with a short-term loan arrangement against the estate assets that gave her operating funds while the formal appraisal process proceeded. The first thing she did with the first disbursement was call the landlord at Creekside Gardens. She paid the 2 months of back rent in full, and then, for good measure, paid the next 2 months. Then she gave notice that she would not be renewing. She drove to a Honda dealership in Spokane on a Saturday morning with Caleb, who had been asking to come to every errand and appointment since November in the focused, attached way he had when he was processing something large. She bought a used 2022 CR-V in blue. She paid cash from the disbursement account. She sat in the parking lot for a moment afterward in the new car with the smell of it, and Caleb in the passenger seat looking at the dashboard controls with the same expression he gave the automata and the patent models, which was not wonder exactly, but something more methodical, a careful attention to how things worked. He said, the old car had a name. She said, the Civic didn't have a name. He said, I called it Limpy. In my head. She said, I know. He looked at the dashboard. He said, this one doesn't need a name yet. She said, give it time. She enrolled Caleb in the Colfax School District in January. She had decided early, sometime in December, that she was not going back to Spokane. She was staying. The farmhouse was hers through a negotiated purchase from Derek's estate portion, a transaction that required several difficult phone calls, but that eventually resolved itself in the way that most of her conversations with Derek were resolving now, slowly, without warmth at first, and then, with a reluctant honesty on both sides that was not quite reconciliation but was at least a start. She had paid Derek a fair price for the farmhouse, which was more than the real estate market suggested, and which she had offered voluntarily. He had accepted without comment. He came in March. She had not pushed, and he had not announced. And on a Saturday morning his car appeared at the end of the gravel track, and he got out and stood in the yard for a moment looking at the farmhouse, and then at the path across the field, and then at her, standing on the porch. She made coffee. They sat at Leonard's table. They did not talk about the money, which felt like an agreement they had both silently made in advance. They talked about their mother instead, about Gail, about the way she had managed to make them both feel cared for while also never having quite enough of anything. About the ways Leonard had been present and the ways he had not. About specific memories, a camping trip when Nora was 8 and Derek was 13 and Leonard had spent the entire Saturday building a camp stove from materials he found in the site, producing a working wood-burning stove out of 2 tin cans and a bent piece of screen, as if the commercial camping store version in the truck was irrelevant when an engineering problem was available. She had forgotten that story. Derek told it well. After the coffee, she took him to the workshop. He walked through it the way she had walked through it, slowly, with the accumulating expression of someone whose understanding of a person was being revised in real time. He stood a long time in front of the Royale, which was still there, on loan back from the Peterson for the press conference that was happening the following month. He stood in the climate room among the patent model shelves, running his fingers along the edges of the models with something careful in the gesture. He did not say much. She did not ask him to. On his way out, at the car, he stopped and said, I kept showing up because I thought that was how you made someone love you. By showing up. She said, I think that's partly right. He said, he loved you in a way he couldn't show up for. She said, I think so. He looked at the building across the field. He said, I don't know if that's better or worse. She said, I don't either. But it's what we have. He drove back toward Spokane, and she stood on the gravel watching the dust settle behind his tires, and thought that this was probably the most honest conversation she had ever had with her brother, and that it had taken their father's death and $300 million worth of hidden automobiles to get them to it, which was the kind of thing that was true and absurd simultaneously, and that she expected to take years to fully understand. Caleb made a friend in the first week, a boy named Eli, whose family farmed 2 sections north of the property, and who appeared most afternoons on a bicycle to play games that ranged across the open ground between the farmhouse and the workshop in ways that Nora watched through the kitchen window with something she recognized as relief. Her son was running. He was 9, and he was running in a field and making the kind of noise that children made when they were not keeping themselves in check. She thought about him on the couch at Creekside Gardens in Spokane, his shoulders squared with the effort of being careful. She thought about him walking to school in the too small coat, carrying his backpack with the focused quiet of a child who had understood without being told that things were tight and that adding to the weight was not his job. She thought about his voice in the darkness of the workshop, calm and specific. Are there a lot of them? He had asked her last week what they were going to do with all the money. She had said they were going to build something. She had said they were going to start a school, a kind of workshop for students who wanted to learn how things worked. She had said some of it would go to the Smithsonian so that the patent models would be available to everyone. He had considered this for a moment and then said, "Can I still go to a normal school?" She had said, "Yes." He had said, "Okay. Can we also get a dog?" They were getting a dog. She had not had a dog in her adult life. There had never been room for one. Not in the apartments she had occupied, not in the budget, not in the hours she had available after 2 jobs and 1 child and the constant arithmetic of not quite enough. She had a house now and a field and a budget that no longer required arithmetic. She was still adjusting to that. She suspected she would be adjusting to it for a long time, that the condition of scarcity did not simply lift when the circumstances changed, but had to be gently, persistently unlearned, the way a body held tension in muscles it had forgotten it was clenching. She gave herself permission to be slow about it. There was time. That was one of the things that had changed. The other thing that had changed, the one she had not anticipated and that she thought about often, was the weight of her father's collection. Not its financial weight. That was enormous and real and required lawyers and curators and institutional agreements and a foundation structure and years of careful work still ahead. She meant something else by weight. She meant the feeling of carrying something someone had built for you, something that large and patient and precise, across the distance of years and silence and all the things that had not been said. The feeling of receiving something that could not be returned and could not be declined and had to be held differently than anything she had held before. She was learning how to hold it. She was not there yet. She found the last logbook the week after the appraisal figures came in. Volume 11, the final one, stored separately in the climate room rather than on the workbench with the others. She had missed it in the first pass. It was thinner than the others, only a third full, the entries stopping abruptly in late 2022 when Leonard's handwriting had been visibly affected by something she now understood was the early neurological changes that preceded the stroke. The last acquisition entry was dated October 2022. Unit 047, a 1921 Douglas motorcycle from the estate of a collector in Aberdeen, Scotland. The entry was complete and precise in the usual way: provenance, condition, acquisition price, current condition. Below the standard notation, in the same handwriting, slightly larger and more deliberate, written as if the effort of it was being managed carefully, was something that was not an acquisition note. It was not formatted like a logbook entry. It was formatted like a letter. She stood in the climate room and read it. "Nora, if you're reading this, things went the way I hoped they would go. I know I was not what you needed. I know I made decisions about the work and about myself that cost you something you should not have had to pay. I don't have a good account of why I made those decisions. I made them because I was the kind of person I was, and being that person meant some things were possible for me and other things were not. Connection was not easy. Words were not easy. This was. I started collecting when I was 26. The first piece was a 1937 Cord 812, and I bought it for $200 from a farmer outside Pendleton who needed the barn space. I drove it home in a thunderstorm with no wipers and a heater that worked only on the left side, and I remember thinking that I had never been so happy in my life, not because of the car, but because of what it meant that something this good had been waiting in a barn and nobody had understood what it was. That has been my life's work, finding the things that nobody understood. I am sorry I was not better at finding the people. Everything in this building was built or made or imagined by someone who cared about precision and beauty and the question of how things worked. That is what I care about too. It is not enough to explain the other parts of a person, but it is something. I hope you keep some of it. I hope you understand some of it. I hope you are well, and that your son is well, and that whatever you build from here is yours in the way that nothing was mine until I found this work. With love, which I know I was not good at showing. Your father." She read it standing in the climate room with the humidity control humming in the corner and the spring light coming through the door she had propped open. She read it twice. She held the volume closed in both hands for a long time afterward, feeling the weight of it, which was not just the weight of the book. She had been angry at him for years in the quiet, persistent way that anger went when it had nowhere useful to go and no occasion to be expressed. The anger had been folded into ordinary things, into the effort of managing alone, into the arithmetic of not enough. She had not known how much of it she was carrying until she read those lines. Finding the things that nobody understood. I am sorry I was not better at finding the people. He had known. He had known exactly what the failure was and had not been able to correct it and had written it down in the back of the last logbook of his life, in the only form of honesty available to him, which was the form he had always used, precise, notated, preserved for someone who would come later. She thought about the cedar sign and what it had cost him to write her name on it and bolt it to the concrete and walk away, trusting that she would eventually come and that when she came she would understand enough to not just sell it. He had been right about her. She was going to have to find a way to be grateful for that, and for the rest of it too, the silence and the distance, and the 30 years, and the building full of the most important things he knew how to care for. She was going to have to find a way to hold all of it at the same time, the grief and the gift, the father he had been and the one he had left behind in a logbook. She was working on it. She had time. She went back into the main building. Outside, the field was green with spring. Caleb and Eli were somewhere in it, their voices carrying across the open ground, high and particular and free. Outside, Caleb and Eli were doing something complicated in the open ground between the farmhouse and the workshop, a game that seemed to involve running to the workshop wall and back, and whose rules Nora had not fully been able to reconstruct from observation. Caleb's voice carried across the field, high and clear, the voice he used when he was not managing himself. She had made a decision about the collection that she had not announced and would announce at the press conference Birch was arranging for the following month in Spokane. The decision was this: the most historically significant pieces, the vehicles whose meaning was not just financial but cultural and technological, would not be auctioned into private hands where they might disappear again into sealed rooms for another 30 years. The Royale had gone to the Peterson Automotive Museum in Los Angeles on terms that required public access 300 days a year. One GTO had gone to the Museo Ferrari in Maranello. The other had been placed with a foundation in California that maintained its use as a driving car and sanctioned historic events, because Leonard's maintenance record showed he had run the GTO regularly, and she thought he would have understood and approved. The Talbot Lego went to a French automotive museum in Le Mans. The Duesenberg went to the Auburn Cord Duesenberg Automobile Museum in Indiana, where it was displayed beside a Cord 812 that turned out to be a sister car to the first vehicle Leonard had ever bought, a fact that made Sarah Crane pause mid-sentence when she noticed it, and then go quiet in the particular way of someone absorbing something that mattered more than they could immediately say. The patent models went to the Smithsonian in their entirety, under a formal agreement that named the collection the Vance Patent Model Collection and funded ongoing research into each of the 247 items with money from the Leonard Vance Foundation. Dr. Okafor called Nora on the day the models arrived in Washington to tell her they were being installed and that his team was documenting them individually, and his voice had a quality she had not heard from him before, which was the sound of a serious person allowing themselves to be moved by the thing they had worked toward. The automata were placed with 3 institutions on long-term loan agreements, all with public access requirements, with formal ownership remaining with the foundation. The Geneva specialist Margaret had consulted came to Colfax in February to see them in person before they were shipped, and she spent a full day in the building examining each one. And on her way out she said to Nora, "Your father understood these objects in a way that is rare. He did not just collect them. He understood why they were made and what the people who made them were trying to say. That is not a common thing." The vehicles that went to auction, 7 of the 47 that were significant but not in the category of the Royale or the GTOs, brought a combined $58 million across 2 sales in Monterey and Paris that were attended by automotive collectors from 14 countries and covered by media that did not normally cover auction events. One of the 7, a 1933 Alfa Romeo 8C 2300 Monza that had raced at Mille Miglia in 1934, set a new record for its model at auction and was purchased by a museum in Milan that had been searching for an example in original specification for 40 years. The total, across all categories, across 18 months of formal assessment and institutional negotiation and 2 auction sales, came to $485 million. The foundation's initial endowment was funded at $150 million, which the board, consisting of Nora, Margaret, Birch, Sarah Crane, and Dr. Okafor, determined was sufficient to operate in perpetuity with careful management. The foundation's mandate was specific: support engineering, fabrication, and mechanical arts education for students in rural eastern Washington, with preference for students from low-income households. The first cohort of 12 high school students began using the renovated workshop in September. They were learning to weld, to machine, to build things from drawings, to maintain engines, to understand how the made world came to be made. The polished hardwood floors stayed. The pegboard stayed, now carrying different tools for different hands. The logbook cabinet stayed, with all 11 volumes preserved behind glass, visible to anyone who walked through. On the first day of the program, Nora had stood in front of the 12 students and said, "The man who built this building spent his life finding things that nobody understood the value of and taking care of them correctly. That is what we're going to teach you to do. Not necessarily with things worth millions of dollars. With whatever is in front of you that deserves to be understood and handled correctly." A girl named Sophia, from a town 40 miles south, had raised her hand and asked, "What if we build something nobody has ever made before?" Nora had said, "That's the goal." Some of these students would eventually build things that had not been built before. Some of them already had ideas they had not yet told anyone about, ideas they were keeping internal because they were not yet sure the world had room for them. Leonard would have recognized that. He had done the same thing for most of his life. The difference was that these students would have somewhere to bring the ideas before 30 years passed. The cedar sign was the last thing she moved. She carried it from the north wall of the exterior herself. On a morning in late May when the Palouse was turning green and the air smelled like soil and growth and the particular clean of eastern Washington in spring. She had unbolted it from the concrete the night before and left it on the workbench overnight. Now she carried it across the field to the farmhouse and hung it in the kitchen where the bare bulb used to be, above the table where she had sat at midnight reading the logbook with shaking hands. For Nora, when the time is right, she stood back and looked at it. The photograph hung beside it. The snapshot from 1994, a 9-year-old girl sitting on her father's lap on a wooden stool in the unfinished building, the concrete floor still rough and unpolished, both of them looking in different directions, both of them already inside the story that would take 30 years to tell. She had had it framed in the weeks after the appraisal, in a plain wood frame that looked like something Leonard would have chosen. She had hung it herself. Caleb came in from the field with Eli behind him, both of them grass-stained and breathing hard from whatever the game required. He looked at the cedar sign and at the photograph and then at his mother. He said, "You hung them up." She said, "I did." He studied the photograph with the focused look he gave things that were asking him to understand something. He said, "We look the same. You and me. The same face when we're figuring something out." She looked at the photograph. At herself at 9 with 2 braids and a missing back tooth, in a building that had not yet been sealed, on a man's lap. Both of them looking in different directions. Both of them already inside a story that would take 30 years to complete. She thought maybe Caleb was right. She thought maybe that was what Leonard had seen when he wrote, "Before we close it up," on the back of the photograph, the face that would come back eventually and stop instead of selling and go back to the car for a phone and come back into the dark and count. He had built something large enough that you had to stop to understand it. He had put her name on the door. Margaret appeared in the doorway with a casserole dish and the expression she wore when she had decided to feed someone whether or not they had asked, which was most evenings now. She had become the foundation's first executive director in February, in the same way she had done everything else since November, without drama, by organizing what needed to be organized and doing what needed to be done and not requiring any of it to be discussed. She looked at the sign and the photograph and said, "That's right. Those belong there." She set the casserole on the table and went back to the car for the serving spoon, and the kitchen filled with the smell of something warm and made with care, and outside the field turned toward evening in the colors that the Palouse made in late May, green going gold going something in between, the hills folding gently away in every direction, patient and large. Nora sat at the table that had been Leonard's table and thought about everything it had taken to get to this kitchen on this evening in this field. She thought about the diner on Francis Avenue and the office buildings she had cleaned and the Honda she had monitored every morning like a patient in critical care. She thought about the notice in yellow with the red stamp. She thought about the drive across the Steptoe Butte grade with Caleb's library book on his lap and the temperature gauge climbing and her hand moving toward it and then moving back. She thought about the gravel track and the cedar sign and the leather cord and the darkness of a building that smelled like something preserved and patient and worth understanding. She thought about her father walking that frost-covered path every single morning for 30 years. What that looked like from the outside. A quiet man, alone, going to a building, coming back. What it looked like from inside. A life organized entirely around the belief that some things were worth the cost of caring for them correctly. She was his daughter. She had not known that fully until this year, not the full weight of it. She had his face, apparently, in the moments that mattered. She had his quality of attention. She had, somewhere in her, the same capacity to look at a thing and understand what it was worth before anyone else had bothered to look at it carefully. She had used that capacity to keep Caleb fed and clothed in the years at Creekside Gardens, in ways that did not look glamorous and did not produce logbook entries, but that required the same essential discipline, precision, care, the refusal to give up on something because it was difficult. She had not wasted those years. She had been practicing. Leonard had built something and left it to her. She was building something with it. 12 students in a workshop. A foundation that would outlast all of them. A Royale in Los Angeles. Accessible, where anyone could stand in front of it. Patent models in the Smithsonian, being studied, being understood. The things that had waited for the right person were in the right hands now. Some of them public and some of them permanent, and all of them cared for correctly. The letter in the back of volume 11 said, "Whatever you build from here is yours in the way that nothing was mine until I found this work." She was building. It was hers. That was exactly enough. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying, but it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.